Oh, just
Sorry.
gonna mark that recording. Okay. Yep. No worries. So yeah, the purpose of this is really just to continue that conversation, to talk about, what has worked, what hasn't worked in terms of Passive House. I have my own perspective from what I've been doing, especially in the New York area. And I'm sure that it differs depending on where everyone is, but I think that there are a lot of common themes and lessons to be drawn out from the various experiences of everyone here. So I'm going to drop into the chat here, just if everyone wanted to do an intro. It is great to do these sessions as a bit more interactive, so it's not just like passively presenting presentation to everyone, which I think a year on into the virtual era can get a bit monotonous. But if everyone just wants to introduce themselves in terms of their name, where they're located, pronouns, and your kind of involvement in the industry, that would be great. So I'm just going to kick that off over there. A little bit of background, as Kara had mentioned. So I run a nonprofit called Earth Day Initiative, and I also work as a real estate broker focused on green and healthy homes, real estate broker / consultant in that space. That led me to end up teaching a course on marketing green homes at New York University. And I'll talk about all of that as we're presenting here today, but let me pull up to share my screen really quick. Just 1 second. Sorry, just 1 second. And Kara, do you just want to give me a heads up nod that you can see the screen? You're good?
Yes.
Okay, good. So yeah, basically what we're going to be talking about is marketing green homes, and the things that we have done in this area with our consultancy. And then through this course that I taught at NYU, exploring these issues. This presentation is laid out basically in the way that I formatted and structured that course at NYU. And the whole inspiration for this was through the work that I do at Earth Day Initiative. So Earth Day Initiative is a nonprofit organization. We've been around for more than 30 years. We started out organizing large-scale Earth Day events, which I know is kind of a bigger thing in the US than it is in some other parts of the world. But we were organizing Earth Day events to connect people to sustainability initiatives, things that they could do in their own lives to make a positive green impact, different environmental or climate campaigns. We have a sustainable food education program where we work in various schools and connect students to career opportunities in sustainable food industry. We have a renewable energy campaign, and we have a green buildings publication. And the green buildings publication is really what inspired the work in getting involved more as a real estate broker and consultant and the green and healthy home space, because the green buildings publication that we have put together, it's called Lessons Learned. And historically, it has been a lot of case studies of different sustainable buildings. It has been discussions of trends and developments in the green building industry. This publication back in like the early 2000s. It might have been even the late 90s now that I think about it. But my work on that publication, working with our founder, who was a really early leader in green buildings. So she did, for instance, the green credentials for 4 Times Square, which is a skyscraper in New York, One Bryant Park, One World Trade Center at the top of the One World Observatory, at the top of the World Trade Center, Barclays Center in New York, a lot of different high profile projects working on the sort of sustainability characteristics of those buildings. Working with her on this publication, something clicked with me where I thought, this publication is so unlike every program that we have at Earth Day Initiative, because we as a nonprofit are very public facing and very much communicating to the average person. So it's very much talking to someone about what they can do in their own lives, talking to people either who are already sort of green-minded and environmentalist, or just the average person. Maybe they're not, because in the US especially, Earth Day is this one day a year that everyone wants to do something. And our founder always said that Earth Day is like the gateway drug into the environmental movement, or at least that's how we want to use it. Whereas basically you expose people to something sustainable, something green, something resonates with them, and then they get a little involved and they get a little more involved, and they sort of go down a path of increasingly getting involved in sustainability causes, climate campaigns, environmental movement stuff. And this publication was very different from that, in that this green buildings publication was a lot of industry talking to industry. So we would solicit articles by developers and architects and designers, and then the readership was developers and architects and designers. But no average person was going to pick up this publication and just read about green buildings. It was way too wonky, way too technical, way too filled with jargon. It was really not explaining things in a way that would resonate with the average person. And I thought that was strange, given that every other program that we have at Earth Day Initiative is very much focused on communicating sometimes difficult to communicate concepts around sustainability to the average person, to the broader public. So as I thought more about that, I talked to a lot of folks, especially in the US, behind USGBC and in Passive House, from IWBI, the WELL Standard. I talked to folks about this issue of breaking through to the mainstream and communicating this to the average person. And pretty much everyone I talked to, including at these, governing organizations, agreed that it's really been a challenge, and less effort in some cases has been made to communicate to the broader public, because a lot more effort has been made to communicate to industry, and even more on the commercial side. In some cases, it's bigger bang for your buck if you can convince, the couple of people at some office or commercial space to go in a more sustainable direction, rather than trying to convince every homeowner, which are typically dealing with smaller spaces than the average commercial space. So everyone kind of agreed through these discussions that a lot has fallen down in terms of communicating to the broader public and the residential sector the benefits of more sustainable homes. Then, as I continued to look into this over the years, I experienced in my own life kind of the level of discussion around green homes, even when something was built to a more ambitious, sustainable standard. Actually, Kara, I do want to mention, I can't see the chat while I'm presenting right now. So if anyone does have like an urgent thing, like you need me to speak up or whatever, if you want to just interrupt, feel free.
I will.
If you need to tell me anything throughout. So as I started to explore this more, I would look into, how are the buildings, the projects that I know are being built to a sustainable standard, how are those being communicated to the public? And typically, what I found was not great. A lot of the folks that are sort of the communication points with the general public, or home buyers, or just the average person, so often it's real estate brokers, they're really used to talking about particular characteristics of homes, and they are not used to talking about anything related to sustainability. So I would go to open houses, this is back pre-COVID when we had open houses many years ago, go to open houses for a residential project that was being built in New York or was completed, and I knew that it had been built to a very sustainable standard. And I would ask the broker, oh, can you tell me a bit about the green credentials for the building? And the broker says something along the lines of, yeah, I think it's getting LEED certification. And you're just like, oh my God, if that's the beginning of the conversation where this broker doesn't even know the acronym is pronounced LEED, then this conversation is really not going to go very far. And then I would attempt to try to sort of like get more information about the green credentials for the building. And they would kind of talk about, oh, there's like natural materials or maybe like energy saving stuff, but they didn't really have any information beyond that. And this continued to be my experience when I would talk to folks that were representing properties that had been built to a much more sustainable standard. I went to another prominent building, a high rise here in New York that was pursuing a really ambitious zero waste strategy in terms of diverting all of the waste from the building into different streams where it wouldn't just go to landfill. I tried to talk to the broker a bit about this. She even knew that that was why I was visiting the building. So you might have thought that she would have read up about it a bit before me visiting. She really couldn't tell me anything about it. And I kind of tried to tease it out a little bit. Again, she just starts talking to me about how the countertops are made out of like a natural finish. So it kind of resembles wood, which has nothing to do with the green credentials for the building at all. Even more recently, I was working with some clients who were interested in a particular building that I had put in front of them in New York City, and it was achieving some level of LEED certification. And I wanted to figure out exactly like what level of LEED certification. So I emailed the broker on that project and asked her what level of LEED certification that they were getting. I immediately got a response back that said something along the lines of, "We're not getting LEED certification." So then I went to their website and found where it said LEED certification, circled it with a screenshot, sent it back to her and said, just to be clear, because I want to make sure I'm giving the correct information to my clients, the website does say that you're achieving LEED certification. Is that not true? Flash forward 7 hours, she emails me back, "Oh yes, we are getting LEED certification." She still did not answer the question that I came to her with of what level of LEED certification. So we just waited 7 hours to confirm that what it already said on the website was true. But this is all to say that this is really the level of discussion around green homes that what I had talked to people about was that there's this huge missed opportunity for those of us that care about sustainability to be actually building the demand and then subsequently we hope the supply of more sustainable buildings, because right now so much of it in New York is just based on the supply side. A developer, for whatever reason, when there's a variety of reasons that a developer in the US or New York might pursue some sustainability credentials for their building, and they do that, but it's largely not tied to any demand. And what I was talking to people about was if we can try to attempt to increase the demand so that people are actually interested in this on the demand side, home buyers are actually asking these questions, they're being educated about this stuff, then perhaps that will increase the supply even more. But the current state of marketing is talking a lot about marble countertops, brand name appliances, obviously location, but it's all of the traditional things that you would talk about when you're marketing real estate, even when I know that that property has been built to a much more ambitious, sustainable standard. It's just not being communicated out there in a lot of cases. And when it is, it often is so jargon filled and it is sort of flying over the heads of the people that it's being communicated to, which is something that I know I'm guilty of, and people in the sustainable world in general often are guilty of, because we talk about what we care about. And it's like, oh, I think this is so interesting how they achieved this, and this is the technology behind it, and all of that. But the average person might not really care about that, or they're just not really well versed in it. So it's all going over their heads. So that was sort of what led me onto this path of going from the nonprofit into working with a team around building out a real estate brokerage practice and consultancy, where we really aim to connect people with the different properties that are healthier and more sustainable, and they're better for the health and well-being of their families and the environment, but they just haven't really been talked about thus far. So that could be a variety of different credentials, including passive house. It could be properties built to not necessarily a specific certification, but are generally just high performance buildings. But the idea is to stimulate that conversation so that we can raise the overall demand for greener properties. There is demand out there already, but it's the kind of thing that people don't know to be asking for. They don't know how to seek it out. So that's where we come in, where it's like, hey, we understand that you probably don't understand a ton of the technicalities of this stuff, but we can kind of provide those translation services when you're looking for a home. Subsequently, then I wound up teaching a course recently at New York University that was focused on marketing green homes. And it looks at this issue from a variety of different spectrums, but it's really trying to overcome one challenge, which is just the general lack of communication period around this stuff. And then the second is communicating around the things that aren't necessarily the things that are going to resonate the most. And I know that a lot of the groups represented here, the individuals and groups represented here, have also thought about this in terms of, okay, how are we actually going to sell this? And I'm excited to talk to everyone today about their own perspectives on what has worked and what has not worked. So when we were thinking about this with our real estate brokerage practice and also through this course at NYU, one of the things that we really wanted to do was look to the lessons in other sustainability industries, because through my work at Earth Day Initiative, we're not just focused on buildings, we're really representing all kinds of different interest groups and stakeholders and entry points into sustainability and the environment. And one sector that we really wanted to use as a model to draw lessons from is sustainable food. So in my mind, sustainable food is really that sustainability industry that broke through ahead of any others. So it's a lot more advanced and mature as a sustainability industry than any other industry, in my opinion. And it broke through for a variety of reasons, including a lot of, at least in the US, a lot of high profile folks throwing their clout behind it. I mean, Michelle Obama made sustainable and healthy food one of her pet causes when she was in the White House. We had a lot of celebrity chefs talking about sustainable food. Farm to table became sort of the hottest restaurant in town. That became a catchphrase. But I think that there are certain lessons that we can draw from that. And one of the reasons why I think sustainable food broke through to the mainstream before other industries is because it is the most personal. So just as you look at the human body going concentric circles outward, so food goes in your body, fashion, beauty, healthcare products go on your body, and then our human bodies go into the built environment, so our buildings. And I think it's not a coincidence that food really broke through to first, because it is the most personal, and that these are substances you're actually putting into your body. I think some of the lessons that we drew from this is health and wellness is a big thing. So talking about health and wellness and how food affects the health and wellness of you and your family is really powerful. So an example that I often give when thinking this through is, I would hazard to guess that the average person who buys organic food perhaps feels great about that impact on the environment, but might be more powerfully motivated by the belief that organic food is good for the health and wellness of them and their families. So reducing exposure to pesticides and other toxic products, that health and wellness factor of how is this good for me, that resonates really powerfully in a way that perhaps environmental sustainability people can be motivated by it. There's a segment of the population that's going to be motivated by that, but the average person is probably most motivated by that health and wellness factor. And the demographic that I think of a lot, at least in the market that we're operating the most in here, is in New York City. So young, educated parents who live in an urban environment like New York City spend a lot of time thinking about health and wellness and the health and wellness of their families. So there's a whole demographic of young moms in the city that obsess about organic food and natural fiber clothing and non-toxic toys and fitness classes for them and their children. And that is a language that you can speak when it comes to the home that goes beyond the traditional sort of technical sustainability oriented language. This can be a really powerful motivator. And I think that food really shows us this, that health and wellness and the discussion of organic and farm to table and natural foods really has broken through because it tapped into that health and wellness trend that has developed over the last few years that makes it really personal, that is a really powerful motivator. A second broad lesson that we learned from looking at sustainable food is, I think it really illustrates how the sustainability conversation in general has grown up in the last 30, 40, 50 years. So go back several decades, and the sustainable product often was associated with some sort of sacrifice. So if you were going to go with some sustainable option, you were probably being told, and you also believed, that you were somehow going to sacrifice based on this. And there's the example of like low flow, water efficient shower heads, that when various municipalities started mandating this by regulation to have low flow water shower heads, there was created a black market for water inefficient shower heads because everyone wanted water pressure. And that was sort of the association with a lot of sustainable products in the building space, for instance, or just in consumer goods. There was a belief that the more sustainable option often was just worse. That it was something that you were doing because it's better for the environment and you care about that, but actually it's going to be a lower quality product. So if you have like a sustainable adhesive, a sustainable glue, it just fundamentally wouldn't work as well. That you would glue it and then it would fall off, and great, it's good for the planet, but it like just doesn't work as well. And that was an association that a lot of people created in their own minds and was created for them around the more sustainable options. And the sustainable food industry is a good example of how that has flipped over the past couple of decades. That a lot of the more like sustainable options now are associated with a premium product, and food illustrates that perfectly, in that farm to table and organic and local and seasonal, these all became synonymous with a premium product. And I think folks like Michael Pollan with Omnivore's Dilemma went a long way to explaining the higher quality of organic food and food that is grown in a more natural system rather than the industrial foods process. And the association became organic, local, seasonal, farm to table. In people's minds, that was premium. So the farm to table restaurant is the hottest restaurant in town. This is not like some like hippie fringe that's going to the farm to table restaurant. Again, not to like just use the example of the Obamas, but when the Obamas went to Blue Hill in New York, it was trending on all of everyone's like computer news alerts, and it became this trendy thing where the farm to table restaurant was actually the premium, and that's where everyone wanted to go, and people associated that with luxury. And I think that that is something that in general has really flipped with sustainability, and that's a big lesson that we try to bring to all of our marketing, where we stop talking about sustainability as a sacrifice and start talking about it as fundamentally a higher quality product. And I think that that absolutely applies to buildings. And I think that some of the discussion or the vernacular that we have around buildings has reflected that in good ways. I think there are things that we can increasingly do around that in terms of high performance building. It says it right there in the phrase that it's actually like a higher quality building and that it's high performance. Anything that is actually talking about it as a premium building rather than like, oh, it's a sustainable building, but you're not just telling people, but it's actually just a higher quality building, which is really what I think we should be communicating to people front and foremost. Then the next industry that we looked at was the sustainable fashion industry. So again, thinking through the sort of concentric circles radiating out from the human body, food goes in your body, fashion goes on your body, the built environment, your body goes in. I still think we're a ways off in terms of breaking through to the mainstream on the built environment, but with sustainable fashion, that is kind of the next wave in my mind of what has started to break through to the mainstream. And again, there are certain common themes that also relate back to food that illustrate sort of what has worked. And one of those is communicating around luxury. So communicating around like higher quality products, in some cases, stop beating people over the head with like just the sustainable aspect of it. But some of the fashion companies that I have seen really take off in the sustainability space, or they were more traditional fashion companies, but they gravitated towards sustainability and in some cases done that successfully, is because they just were cool. They basically created a product that people wanted. Celebrities wore them. So when Emma Watson is wearing some sustainable dress on the red carpet, people then look up that company and they gravitate toward it. And it wasn't always leading with sustainability, but it was leading with good design. So it was leading with things that people wanted, leading with being cool. And why have people gravitated toward any fashion in the history of fashion? It's been because it looks good and because it's associated with coolness and being on trend. And I have seen industries do that in a successful way by focusing on that and using that sort of like quality spectrum as a guide that goes back to food, where it was like, stop focusing so much just on the environmental sustainability, but just talk about it being a higher quality product. I think fashion, we have definitely seen this come through. It's also been sort of capitalizing on different trends in terms of when something makes the headlines, really leaping on it in a smart way to publicize even like health and wellness. So they've also leapt on the health and wellness trend in terms of talking to people about not having exposure to toxic materials in your clothing, in terms of the kind of toxic things that can be in a lot of products that haven't been manufactured in a sustainable way. So then the different spectrums that then we draw from, there's three different categories just for our own internal thinking. And obviously a lot of the messaging that you're putting out there bleeds into different categories. So it's not all like just one category at a time, but it's often overlapping into multiple categories. One is a focus on environmental sustainability. So in our own work and through this course at NYU and then the work that we're doing with the real estate brokerage, it's not leaving sustainability to the side, but it's really leaning into the things that seem to be resonating with different groups of people. And, you know, it changes depending on the group of people that you're talking to. For some people, it really is, you know, the concern about the environment, about climate change and our own impact on the planet. But in some cases, it's resiliency. So that is a piece of environmental sustainability that I have really seen take off in a lot of communities in recent years, especially following particular events. So in New York City, as an example, after Hurricane Sandy, sometimes referred to as Superstorm Sandy, it really, there's a lot of devastation that took place in New York City itself and the surrounding communities. And the city and just the general population responded in a way where climate change leapt to the forefront of a lot of people's minds because people felt like they had really witnessed the local effects of global climate change. So there were communities and neighborhoods of New York City that had not historically been involved or known to be involved in climate activism that all of a sudden became advocates around climate action. And these were from communities that maybe were not so liberal, they were more on the conservative end of the spectrum even, and really had not been associated with climate activism, but they had seen those effects of climate change right here with their homes flooding, their homes completely being destroyed, the continued threat of rising sea levels in some parts of where they live. So there was that reaction that we saw where resiliency really became top of mind. So it wasn't even sort of this like care for the environment or care for planet Earth in a vague way, but it was a very concrete, practical sense of we need to deal with this in order to maintain our current way of life and maintain, for instance, our property values. So the city itself reacted in a way, creating a whole office of resiliency, but then individuals also reacted in this way. We also saw other versions of this with different environmental climate related disasters across the US with a lot of hurricanes in the South, wildfires in California. People have become much more resiliency minded. So that has become a language that we have been able to speak, saying, you know, there are actually homes that you could live in that are less reliant on the grid. You actually would be less susceptible to blackouts, electricity blackouts in the future. You will be less part of contributing to the problem of climate change. There's all of these different things connected to resiliency that have resonated with people that in a way environmental sustainability hadn't before. Location, just to use another example. So I have clients that I recently was working with who specifically they were looking for a brownstone like townhouse, like the traditional looking townhouse that a lot of people associate with New York City. We were working to buy a property like that in Brooklyn, but there were whole neighborhoods of Brooklyn that we ruled out. And there were great looking homes that we could have gone to look at, but we did not look at in New York City because they're in a very low lying area that has flooded in the past, for instance, around Hurricane Sandy. And the expectation is that with increasing extreme weather events and rising sea levels, those areas will increasingly be susceptible. So that is a very concrete example of how resiliency is impacting people's future home buying decisions. Then the second sort of spectrum that we're communicating along, so the first one, environmental sustainability, including resiliency. The second is wellness. So this I spoke a bit about when I was talking about food and fashion, to use those as examples. And this is really the strongest spectrum, in my opinion, at least in the US market, to be talking to people about. People are very health and wellness conscious these days. And there have been a lot of trends that we have seen with different foods or household products or chemicals and clothes that once people are made aware of them, they really react to it. And industries have been forced to change their own behavior based on just general awareness building amongst the public, where all of a sudden people are concerned about some particular substance because a lot of work has been done by advocates and those in the perhaps the nonprofit space to build awareness around this, and then change does come as a result of that. And I think that that is a really strong motivator for people, that when we are talking in New York City in our market about Passive House, for instance, we're talking about better air quality, better light quality, like less reliance on artificial lighting for in the home, comfort. We're talking about a lot of things that really resonate with people in a concrete way, because it's something that they can experience in their daily lives. And again, we're using the example of young parents in the city that are really conscious about this stuff and go to great lengths to build the healthiest environment for their children. And if you're communicating about all of the ways that a more sustainable, healthier home could impact the well-being of their family, that has really resonated with people. And I'll show you an example of how we really leaned into this with a project here in New York City recently, kind of toward the end of this presentation. Another is a focus on economics. So obviously when people are purchasing a home, people are thinking a lot about the value of what is this going to cost me? What is the future value going to be? This is a conversation that we are absolutely leaning into, especially with particular buyers that are very value conscious. Maybe they want to understand the lower operating costs, but this is a conversation that has not been had in a lot of examples that I have seen of more sustainable buildings, that it's just not being communicated. That if it's a building that has been built to a more sustainable standard, and therefore the operating costs are much lower, the electricity usage is much lower, the general energy usage is much lower, it's just not really adequately being communicated. And this is something that obviously is, people do like statistics. They find it interesting when you actually can make direct comparisons between a traditional home and a more sustainable home, like how much will this save me? This is a conversation that people would have if only we would have it with them. So that's one of the things that we've really leaned into with our brokerage and consultancy, of communicating this to the public in concrete terms, because there are the numbers there. The one part that is historically a bit more of a mixed bag and more difficult to communicate is convincing folks that a more sustainable home is inherently of higher value, because there is really mixed data out there across the US about if greener homes can fetch a higher asking price on the market. I think that data is really flawed because, as I have described, we don't really know what that looks like of marketing a traditional home versus marketing a more sustainable home and actually telling people the benefits. That experiment hasn't really been run in a lot of cases, because in the case of the more sustainable home, people have not been presented with that information. So a lot of the sort of benefits of a more sustainable home haven't been communicated. So that's just not a study that we can really look at of seeing like what could homes fetch if they were adequately communicated. We have a small data pool around that because a lot of the homes that have been built to a more sustainable standard just aren't being marketed in that way. So there isn't a ton of evidence. One of the things that we have found opportunity on, though, is really tapping into people's belief that resiliency is going to be an increasing concern going forward. That does seem to resonate with folks in terms of, yeah, the more sustainable home is going to get you through a more volatile energy market in the future. It's going to resonate with people going forward as people see more of the effects of climate change and extreme weather events. So that is something that the resiliency angle and people's belief that this is going to be something that people are more concerned about in the future, that has really resonated with people in terms of that value conversation that people seem to be willing to have. So then, taking this as an example of kind of the different spectrums of how we're always trying to communicate how this is good for the end user. So often the conversation that has been had, or I have seen folks in the green building industry focus on, it's often, like I mentioned, it's us talking about why we care about it, and why I often care about it is the sustainability angle. And I think a lot of folks who got involved in green buildings from the beginning, they were often communicating around, this building standard is great for the environment. It impacts the environment in X, Y, and Z ways. This is the impact that it has on climate change because that's what I care about. So folks behind the LEED certification, that's what they were communicating about. That's what they were talking about. That's what the whole USGBC green building, focusing on the green and really just talking about the benefits for the environment more than anything else, that has been a mistake. Because any marketer will tell you that you need to talk about what your consumer cares about, not just what you care about. And there are all these different spectrums around which we would communicate greener, healthier buildings and why it is actually good for you, and don't focus on like how we get there in terms of like, here's the technology that we're building in, get into the jargon and all the industry speak about it, but just talk about the end result. And if then people want to know about kind of how you got there in terms of the technology and how it's built and everything, great, that's a conversation you can have. But what we're trying to always focus in on is the end benefit. So what we would be talking about again with energy is often like a money conversation. So energy efficiency features allow you to use 30 to 60% less energy in the example of a green building that we were talking about here. Then connect that to actually like, how does that connect to one's pocketbook? The average household spends $2,150 on an annual energy bill. So energy efficiency means big savings. So people can really put themselves in the shoes of someone who could live in a greener, healthier home. Like, what does that mean for me and my family? With various sustainable building standards, you do get things like greater exposure to natural light, greater exposure to nature, greater comfort controls, so individualized comfort controls. The average person has no idea that these are factors that go into a lot of green buildings. So I have a friend who started a very successful sustainable fashion company. She's very well versed in sustainability. She runs a successful sustainable fashion company. She can talk to you all about sustainable supply chains. But even she, as a young parent who is very well versed in sustainable fashion, she said to me, like, to be honest, I don't know what a green building is. Does that mean solar panels on the roof or like a green roof? And this is the thing that people often think of when it comes to sustainable buildings. That is the thing that I hear over and over. People just think, oh, probably solar panels on the roof. That's what it means. They don't think of the 100 different factors that go into a more sustainable building that we could be communicating to them if only we were actually talking to them about those end benefits. And it's not just their preconceived notion of like, maybe solar panels, great, or the sort of like getting into the nitty gritty technical jargon. So this is, like I said, an example of where we're really just trying to communicate like, okay, what is the end benefit? So each one of these white boxes is like the end benefit to the person who might live in a green home. And then a blurb next to it that talks about how a sustainable building would accomplish that. So then let me bring up just an example here. I'm going to bring up an example of a project that we worked on here in New York that shows kind of what we were doing, focusing in on a lot of the stuff that I talked about here, leaning into the luxury angle, leaning into the fact that it's just a higher quality product, leaning into the health and wellness angle. So let me bring this up here. And again, Cara, can you just give me a head nod to tell me that you can see this?
I can see that.
Got it. Okay, so this is a project that I worked on to develop their marketing materials as it pertains to any of the sustainable health and wellness, high performance buildings related aspects of the project. So this is called Charlotte of the Upper West Side. It's a very high-end project. So it's a condo here in a landmark district in New York City. And the language that we used around this was all sort of around high performance, talking about it being a higher quality product. The folks that would be in this market range are really looking for like premium product. It's very expensive property. So getting away from any of the conversation that might allude to it being a sacrifice, like we really wanted to steer away from any of those preconceived notions around sustainability, that it's like, oh, okay, great, I can feel good about living in this sustainable building, but it's actually a demotion. So leaning into the example of like, look at what Tesla has done in the space around vehicles, that people associate a Tesla, a sustainable vehicle, with being very high end, very high quality. So then what we did here was we focused in most of the discussion of the sustainability features under a special section around health and wellness. And what we did was we described it in these kind of animations that I'm not sure if it'll translate super well on Zoom, but you can see here the animations that just illustrate the way a passive house building works in terms of retaining heat, bringing heat in. So it's these fun little animations that someone could at least look at this and sort of like grab the concept of how that works. And then along with the discussion here that breaks down in pretty simple terms of like why this is good for you. So this is how the sustainability features of this building benefit you and your family. Then there's a learn more section for those that did want to dive in, the buyer that maybe is more like an early adopter type that's like, oh yeah, I'm actually really interested in the technology behind this. Then we have that section here that you can click on to find out more about all of that. But really just presenting the basics with these animations and the quick blurbs here focusing in on why is this actually good for you? And just everyone loves a cat. So one of the animators wanted to create a cat. So each one of these, again, with like some of these blurbs around some of the statistics that people would find interesting. Really trying to make it playful, trying to make it fun, trying not to make it too wonky. Often the kind of sustainable buildings industry communications that you do see just feel so industry, like they feel like an engineer created them. And what we wanted to do here was we worked with a very high-end graphic design team, graphic design firm, to create these animations that just felt fun and playful, and people could connect with them if you're just, checking out real estate of like places that you and your family might be interested in pursuing. So then running through all these, as you can see, like I said, we did house all of this under health and wellness because for the demographic of buyers that we were looking at, we felt like that was the most attractive angle. So yes, there's a lot in here that's communicating around environmental sustainability. There's a lot in here that's communicating around economics, but the sort of health and wellness category was how we were capturing people to bring them in along that. Because I do think in our market, New York City and the US in general, that still is the area that resonates the best with people in terms of how is this a premium product in terms of health and wellness, telling these stories that people probably haven't heard because they're just not really conversant in sustainable buildings yet. So that concludes the formal kind of presentation here. I see that we have a lot of comments here that I haven't been able to take a look at yet because I was just looking at the presentation screen. But I do want to open it up to chatting with other folks about one of the ways we can organize this is kind of around the different spectrums that we organize that presentation and how I organize the course at NYU. I would love to hear people's like specific thoughts around like what has actually resonated the most with audiences you're talking to. Is it that sustainability angle, explicitly talking about sustainability and resiliency? Is it the health and wellness angle? Is it the economics angle? And bring in Rory and Shelley into the conversation to talk about all of this here. Kara, did you want to take a break before we move into the next section, or are you comfortable just jumping in?
I think as it well, at least in our part of the world, it's still pretty early in the day. I think we're good to continue. Hey, thanks so much for your presentation, John. So my idea was that before we bring our local expert into the conversation, which I definitely want to do, I would just like to pick up on a couple of questions for you directly. So one question that also popped into my mind and any put in the chat was if passive house is trendy, premium, etc., how does that sit with being for the masses? So the dichotomy between luxury and affordability. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. So yeah, this is a question that we get a lot in terms of sort of the equity issues related to sustainable products. So that's a weird double-edged sword in the sustainability space. I feel like that I actually didn't mention in the presentation, but it's something we talked a lot about as we were working with our brokerage and building out that course at NYU, that sustainability faces this weird double-edged and seemingly contradictory challenge of both historically being associated with something that is worse, so it's a worse quality product, but also being expensive because everyone associates sort of like organic food or any sort of sustainable product as costing more. So then you're working against both preconceived notions of like you're buying a worse product, but also you're going to potentially pay more for it. So that's really challenging when you're trying to get people to go for it. Specifically to this question about, you know, you're marketing it as like a luxury, it's a premium thing, but also for the masses. I don't think that's necessarily a contradiction because no one wants sort of like to say, oh, I just want the regular old product. Everyone wants and gravitates toward a premium product. So just because you are marketing it as a sort of higher quality product doesn't mean that any person in the population is like, well, that's not for me then. Because no one is going to say, oh, no, I don't actually want the better quality product. Everyone sort of aspires to that better quality product. It's affordability that is the issue. So with the particular project that I just showed you, that is very expensive and it's not necessarily for the masses. But that's not to say that the marketing isn't applicable to any project, because you do want to tell people, well, why are you actually interested in this product? You know, people even with limited means don't say, well, I don't want organic food because that's associated with a higher quality product. Of course you want the higher quality product. Everyone wants the higher quality product. So we should, I believe, continue to talk about it as being premium. It is better. Be conscious about the prices that get associated with it. And fortunately, I do see a lot of sustainable building and passive house projects being developed at all ends of the market. So municipalities in the US, for instance, are going toward a high performance or passive house standard because it's lowering their own operating costs. So affordable housing projects, which are really being built for folks with more limited means, they can also benefit from this because those projects are being developed and cities and other governments are more conscious of that going forward.
Maybe it's just a mindset that we need to change our expectation that premium means it's only for the select few who can afford it. Premium really should mean it's for particularly for the most vulnerable people who need premium performance. Great, thanks so much, John. Shelley, from your experience, are the issues that John talked about pertinent for the New Zealand market?
Hi.
Recording in progress.
Video on. Thanks, John. Excellent presentation. And absolutely, you know, to use the example of the food industry and the clothing industry is a really great analogy, because people do understand the journey that those industries have been on. And here in New Zealand, I think for the last 10 years, we've been in this educational spot where, you know, 10 years ago, Baden and John would be going to trade stands and talking about passive house, and people would look blankly at them wondering what was passive house, what did that mean? Not even high performing homes wasn't even part of our vocabulary. So, but there's been a big shift, and a bit like the electric car market, it feels like we're in a similar place to do that with our housing, and New Zealanders have finally lifted their heads to think, actually, I deserve more from my new build. And the exciting thing is that as an industry, we're here to say, hello, we're here, we've been doing this, and the benefits that go with it. I think the biggest challenge that we faced was one of the heart over the head. So meaning that passive house traditionally within New Zealand was promoted from a scientific point of view. And we had a job ahead of us to break down a few myths around things like passive houses were ugly, for example. You know, to build a box was way more better from an efficiency point of view, and for passive house to work at its optimum. So we've been kind of working very hard to break down myths like that, myths that you can't open the windows, myths that they're very expensive. So, and those are genuine things that people, you know, those are the things that we get hit with sort of straight away. So part of our role has been to push things like that. You can have a beautiful energy efficient home. At our information evenings, talking about the long-term investment of passive house, with using the example of LED lighting. You know, you could spend $1 on a light bulb, an old incandescent light bulb, and it would last you so long. Or you could spend $15 on an LED bulb and it would last you a lot longer. So sort of shifting people's perception from the cost to the long-term benefits. But one of the biggest things is that we've seen a huge shift in the demographics of our clients, and exactly what you were saying, John, around, you know, these people, young mums wanting the best for their children, wanting this healthy home, conscious of the carpets that are put down and all of that, which is fantastic. So it's talking to those wellness, comfort, and performance obviously is in there as a key part of the benefit of this, but absolutely pushing the comfort and the performance for us has been the lesser of the two. The comfort and the health have been the main things.
Great, thanks, Shelley. Rory, are there any differences between the Australian real estate market and the issues that John highlighted?
Hey, Cara, and hi, everyone. Thanks for having me along today, and thanks, John and Shelley, for sharing. Now, look, you know, at the end of the day, I think, you know, we're all building houses to put happy people into them to get, you know, the best quality of life that they can. So, at the end of the day, we're all trying to, I guess, find the way to communicate. I think what's interesting is, you know, John shared some great examples there from other industries, and we've certainly found by looking to other examples, you know, on other beaten tracks in industries has helped us get insight around how to frame some of these conversations. You know, we've looked at airline industry, for example, and we've also looked at, you know, the fashion industry as well. So I think that's really valuable, that we don't have to go it alone, that there are a lot of people doing a lot of great work if we take the time to stick our head over the ditch and look and listen. You know, I'll admit, you know, we're very early on our passive house journey, but we've been building houses for almost 100 years, you know, so this is kind of, you know, in some ways it's new space for us, but it started with a question of quality. You know, it wasn't a question about should we or should we not build a passive house. It was a question that came up internally about, you know, we play square in the mass market. We are not a luxury developer. You know, don't get me wrong, we've got some expensive apartments and houses, but that's probably more due to their postcode than necessarily, like, you know, the amount of luxury that would necessarily go in. But a few years ago, and this was the genesis to our passive house journey, was we spent, you know, we took our whole Victorian team to sit with, well, actually we sat with our customers first, about 40 of them, got a whole lot of insights around what sustainability means to them. And you aren't far off, John, when you're talking about solar panels. I think trees came a close second. But you know what, the eureka moment that came from talking to our customers over a number of sessions was, someone wants just, you know, whether you're talking about geothermal or, you know, insulation or air tightness, this is all just a good quality home. This is what I'd expect in a high quality home. Didn't say a luxury home, didn't say an expensive home, just said a good quality home. And I think that's what speaks to the masses. So that conversation then went internal, and, you know, there was, you know, thankfully from the leadership, and I don't know who says that they don't want to build a high quality home, but our guys said we want to build a high quality home. That's what we want to do. And kind of put it forward, said, look, if you want to be building high quality homes, you've got to understand where you're at first, understand the delta then between where you're at and where you want to be. That's it. And this was my recommendations, that, look, the highest performing home in the market, you know, that I'm aware of is the passive house home. So why don't we build one? And why don't we measure it for 12 months compared to, you know, a standard home? And then let's see how far our standard product is off, you know, high quality home. It's not saying for a second that all of a sudden we'll flick a switch and start doing passive house everywhere, but it'll definitely help, you know, move the conversation internally for us, and hopefully, you know, the mass market, you know, closer to this higher quality.
Great. Thanks so much, Rory. Everyone, please feel free to switch your microphones on now and ask our three experts here your marketing question, passive house marketing questions.
Yeah, and I did want to, I was actually curious to hear answers on Andy's question about how do people deal with the myths around passive house? Do you engage with them or ignore them? And I thought that was particularly interesting because I wanted to hear, how many folks do you encounter that actually have heard of a myth? Because that assumes that people have even heard of passive house, which the vast majority of people that we engage with, we're starting, fortunately, I guess, in some ways, it's a clean slate. So you're not really dealing with any sort of like preconceived notions. But what is the environment like when you're talking about this stuff with either home buyers or consumers or the general public? In our case, I would say it's like 1 in 100 people that I talk to, I say, passive house, oh, have you heard of that by any chance? And it's like 1 out of 100 has actually even heard of it. So we're not dealing with the myths so much. When we do deal with some of the myths, when we're talking to audiences that are a bit more educated from the onset around high performance buildings and passive house and sustainability in general, typically if they're well versed in this at all, then they don't really have negative preconceived ideas around it, because maybe they work in the industry and they're actually more knowledgeable about it, so they're not dealing with those myths so much. So it's really not something that we have had to encounter so much, because it's not like the case of, you know, what I have seen in Europe, for instance, where a wave of passive house kind of rose up, but then the myths developed around that. We haven't even had that in the US yet. But yeah, Shelley and Rory, like, I'm curious, what percentage of people do you encounter that even know what passive house is when you go into the conversation?
Nah, again, in our context in the mass market, like, we haven't had a customer or a client come to us saying, you know, that we want you to build us a passive house. It actually, well, I might step back. We have actually been asked about, can we have passive house homes? So we had to kind of find a project where we could get that up, but we're bringing that to a project in a market where it's not commonly known, not commonly understood. And people can start to struggle once they get beyond saying they want a high quality home to actually articulate what it is that they think goes into a high quality home. So I think we're at the luxury of where we're kind of big enough. We've made a decision, we're backing ourselves. We're not trying to argue whether we should or shouldn't build a passive house. We've just decided we're doing it. And thankfully we found a builder who was game for this, who was aligned in the vision for delivering a passive house. So we haven't engaged, I guess, is the short answer in terms of this. We haven't felt that we should be the ones to go out and start dispelling any myths, whether perceived or otherwise. But what we are doing is that we're going to be building 2 identical homes, same orientation, same massing. They'll look and feel the same from the outside. And one's going to be passive house and the other won't. And they'll both collect 12 months of data. They'll have 2 different families living in it, but it's going to be the closest comparison that I've seen or heard of, where you can actually compare passive house to a home built to code.
Are you telling the family which one they're in, or is it a placebo?
Oh, look, the cat's out of the bag. So the family are going to understand they're in a passive house, but we're not going to try and preempt that. Like, we're not going to be taking them on a test drive and and kind of stepping through exactly how to use it, because you can design 5-star homes and put 1-star people in it. So I think we just gotta accept that whoever goes in is going to be the person that goes in. Same way in the control home, and this is consistent with other things. We're doing another trial in New South Wales, which isn't looking at passive house, but it's building 50 homes that will generate as much energy as they consume over a 12-month period, and we're doing 10 control homes, and we're not briefing the people who are going to live in them homes either. Just let them do what they do, and then let's start to look at the data that comes out of that.
And Shelley, how about you? The
myth,
percentage of people that you encounter.
Yeah, so for us, it's probably a little bit different in the fact that our whole business is based around passive house. So that's how we launched ourselves. It was all we do. Yeah. We are diversifying a little bit more into having non-certified passive houses and high-performing homes. But at our heart, passive house is who we are. So yes, this was a genuine thing, and probably as fickle as this might sound, programs like Grand Designs and other programs introduced the passive house philosophy to the New Zealand market, and we were quite staggered. We spent 10 years on the home show circuit. People did know about passive here. They might not have known the details of it, which but they had a little bit of a price known indicator on the fact that they just automatically assumed that they were expensive, and also that they presumed that they weren't architecturally designed and good looking homes. So yeah, those were genuine myths that we faced at most events.
Thanks everyone. General audience, so where are you in your passive house marketing pathway, and where do you need input? What are your questions on how to market passive houses or experiences?
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in hearing from folks. Typically when I do this session in New York or North America, hearing about like what worked, like where did you feel like really resonated with people. I have some interesting examples of what people have thrown out there.
Maybe if I could just jump in a little bit, having been involved in a lot of these seminars and information evenings that we've been running, I guess one of the tips for me early on is it's very easy to have a conversation to try and convince somebody on a home show stand. It's completely counterproductive, and don't go there. So if somebody has got to be in their bonnet in terms of what this doesn't do for them, from my perspective, it's much better to actually ask leading questions about what is important to you, and then focus on those things. Because passive house, there's so many facets to it, and all of it has been designed for wellness, comfort, energy efficiency. And in our heads, we've got all that information. And so you can immediately deflate that potentially combative situation by actually just saying, well, asking those key leading questions. What's important to you? Why are you interested in this? And then focus on those things. And then that other thing there, it's often a misunderstanding, but trying to change people's minds in 5 minutes or longer is a complete waste of time, in my opinion. Yeah.
Great, thanks, John. Anyone else has experience with marketing passive houses and wants to share their experiences, or is not there yet but likes to get to being in a good position doing this?
Yeah, well, also building off of what John had said there, while other folks maybe want to chime in with other questions, it reminds me of something that I've talked to people about a lot in this. He said, basically listen, and listen to what the person is actually interested in. But I'm curious at what point a lot of you all even mention passive house, because that's a common thing that I have talked to a lot of folks about, of not leading with passive house. And I think that that is something that I have tended to do in the work that we do, where we really just talk about the end benefits, but don't hit them with a term, passive house, that often they have not heard of. They don't know what that means, but it already puts a sort of thing where it's like, oh, this is a different type of building. Now I have to understand what this is. And they almost get distracted by like, well, now I have to understand what passive house is, rather than focusing on what I think John was kind of hinting at, where it's like, well, what are the things they actually care about, and don't hit them with this term that then they try to understand that like blanket term. I guess, Shelley, in the work that you do, that's perhaps not the greatest approach, because you are really like focused on passive house in your communications. So you kind of have to explain the term that you're introducing people to right off the bat. But I am curious if other folks have had that, where it's like, talk about all the other things. And in some cases, I've heard the example of people that are trying to sell their clients on going in the direction of passive house, but they literally never told their client that it was a passive house. They just sold them on this, and then another thing, and then surprise, they have a passive house. But yeah, Shelley, I'm curious, like from your perspective, you really have to explain it because you're leading with it.
Yeah, so it's a really valid point, and I guess it's part of us understanding what our single-minded proposition was. And for us at eHouse, we've landed on proven, measured performance you can live by. So that's our opening line. So it's about triggering people's thinking around, this is a big investment that you have. Are you confident about how it's going to perform? Is that important to you? So identifying, I guess what John was saying as well, identifying that is important to them. So proven measured performance, and that triggers a conversation that eventually ends up in the passive house sort of circle, obviously, because how do you prove it? Well, we can. How do you do this? We can. And so that's really important. But another thing that's really tricky to do, if you just go back another step, is something that we've tried really hard not to do, is to do scare tactics with people. So the last thing you want somebody going home, dragging their knuckles through their freezing cold, code-built house, thinking I'm in this bomb of unhealthiness and I'm going to die from mold spores, is a terrible position to put them in. So, how do you do that from a sales point of view? And so how we do it is we get them to tell us, what are the things that trouble you about your own home? And it always comes out, it's cold, I have condensation, I have mold. Yes, we have black mold in New Zealand, John. Kiwis live with mushrooms growing in their leather shoes and their wardrobes. And so when they start telling you that, it's a great segue to a conversation around, well, we can solve those problems for you. And we know we can, because the Passive House way is so good.
Thanks, Shelley. Anyone else who wants to contribute to the conversation?
I've got a question for Shelley, if that's okay. Kia ora, Shelley. My name's Nick.
Hi, Nick.
Yeah, hi. Just in terms of, by the way, John, really appreciate all your time, and the whole presentation was was really, really good. Shelley, do you share with your kind of potential customers any sort of like data gathering stuff from like your previous builds to kind of back up, you know, because it all sounds good to the consumer, right? But I know that some of them might want to see actual data and proof. And have you kind of gone down that road, or yourself, or even John?
Yes, will I answer this? Yeah, so
yes, please.
Definitely. So there's two ways we do that. We have on our website, every project that we have up there has got all the performance measures of the home. So we can either take them to the website if they're that interested at that point. But the most effective way we do that, and it's interesting to hear Rory talk about having a baseline of comparison. We did exactly that 11 years ago where we built our first build, and we used that as our baseline, and we put you know, temperature, or we measured it and monitored it for 12 months, and then we asked the neighbours next door if we could just put one measure in their living area where they heated, and on a pull-up banner we just have a very simple graph. It shows just the outside temperature for 1 month over that period. It shows the temperature of the house next door and then the temperature of our home. And the difference, of course, is vast. You know, we had the temperature sort of from 5 degrees to 0 overnight temperatures, and our home sat comfortably sort of at the, you know, 20 to 22, and the neighbour's house was just all over the show. And the cool thing about that is we were able to say you're able to show people that is, you know, the base house was that was the whole house. That was the temperature of every room in the house. This other line was just the room that they heated, just one room in their house. It's very compelling when you can draw on those stats. But again, you don't want to rely on just that to do that, because it's, again, that's just this head stuff where you're trying to do that heart stuff as well. And that's the fine line that we walk in the passive community, is we always lean back on the stats, because it's what we know and love, and we love all that science behind it. So it's getting that balance right and making sure, I think the stats that you use are very simplistic, and you don't have to go into a lot of detail. People could, without you even being there, could understand what that graph's showing them.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the last thing that our sales and marketing team would ever do is present data and try to convince people with numbers. At that point, you're trying to beat them with a graphic or a number. Like, if you can't, like, purchasing a house for the majority of people is an emotive decision, and it's going to be values based. And if you think it's the guy that buys the house, it's not. It's always going to be, you know, the matriarch of the house in terms of what amenity is around, who's it close to, you know. So you've got to sell them on the vision for the home and why this is going to help them, you know, meet their needs. The data, like, we're collecting data on about 100 different homes across Australia, and we're not doing it to turn around and pack it into a sales brochure or to put it onto the website. We're actually doing it to share it with the industry and to show.
Hi,
look,
how are
this,
you? Hi. Good. I'm just home. I'm just on the Zoom, and there's not much today. If I can think of something.
Sorry about that. I just muted that person.
It's all right. But look, yeah, for us, it's about industry change, because we can keep going with doing trials on whether it's zero energy homes, zero carbon homes. You know, state governments are doing this as well. But unless you actually start sharing it with the broader industry and actually showing how this stuff can be accessible, you won't get that change. Like, what's interesting about, you know, customers and quality and premium and not understanding is that if you're a customer, your view is that the government puts in place the regulations to make homes safe, healthy, energy efficient, right? Now, they will ask you, you know, what do you mean a home is not going to keep me warm in winter and cool in summer? The government would make sure that, well, obviously they're not, and we see what's going on with climate commitments depending on, you know, where your home is and that kind of thing. So for us, it's not about for us, it's convincing customers on values, and then it's convincing the industry on data and showing how these homes attract a premium, or maybe it's not even attracting a premium. Maybe you break neutral, but you sell faster. And selling faster is almost as good as attracting a premium to a developer.
I think something else.
Yeah.
To add to that, just another thing, I totally agree with you, Roy, is there's kind of sneaky ways you can do it that are really appealing, and it's something we've just launched on the website, which is about tracking the carbon energy savings of every e-house that we've built. So we've developed a little piggy graphic. He's our carbon piggy, and we get to show in real time every day the carbon savings that are being made through energy alone in that build, and then we've got an accumulative total as well. So again, it's just using those stats in a really balanced, almost fun kind of a way, but the impact of them, they're quite compelling, is still effective.
Great. Joel, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
My headphones aren't great. Okay. I think, yeah, simplicity is definitely kind of the aim of the game, and you always need to remember that people don't know what they don't know. So when, the majority of us kind of, know the ins and outs of passive house and airtightness and all sorts of bits and pieces, but I found it really useful to have an arsenal of simple explanations and metaphors that kind of, normal people understand. Like I said in the chat, there's a simple one of saying, we want water to come in the tap, not through your roof, in the same way you want your fresh air to come through your ventilation system, not through gaps in your walls. So just simple explanations that can kind of get them into terms that they understand has been a really useful key, because a lot of people come in and say, oh, it's passive house. So that's lots of thermal mass and solar gain, isn't it? Just kind of explain a slightly different thing, actually, even though we call it a similar thing in New Zealand. And it's just kind of, just having a kind of a playbook of how to answer the the misconceptions around it have been the most useful kind of thing I think we found.
Thanks, Joe.
I was just going to add something to the comments that Rory and Shelley were just talking about. I'm curious about regulation. With Nick, your question about statistics. And I think, Rory, you had mentioned you were really collecting the statistics sort of for like the back end, not to be like shared with the end users, with home buyers or homeowners. So that has been an interesting development in New York because of the climate regulations that have come into effect just recently. It's starting to seep into the just mass public, so the general public. So people are now more curious because the regulations are sort of ratcheting up energy efficiency. So every building above a certain size in New York now has an energy grade, and you need to have above a certain percentage. So, one building could be like a 91 and another building could be 14. That's putting in people's minds now this conversation around, oh, I don't want to buy in the building that is a 14 because they're going to have to go through various retrofits that are going to be really costly. And if I own in that building, I'm going to get hit with those assessments going forward. So I have people now specifically coming to me as clients saying, I'm looking to buy in a building that is not going to be faced with these additional costs going forward as a result of regulation. The penalties are really high. So you either need to make those retrofits or you're going to be hit with really costly penalties. So people are really curious about that. And I think that having those communications around statistics are going to be increasingly powerful because people really do care about it because of regulation. So I'm curious, the folks here, where do you see regulation fitting into this? What has the regulation been like, and has that sort of spurred conversation in any way, or is that not really something that is factored into the conversations that you're having with the general public yet?
I think we would very much like to factor it in. Unfortunately, there isn't much in terms of regulation that would prompt anyone to build high performance in New Zealand. How's it looking in Australia now, Rory?
Yeah, look, we've had the NATHERS, National Home Energy Rating Scheme, in place for new builds for quite a while. Each state has a different interpretation of what that standard would be. So we have a metric, but compliance in one state, you don't have customers coming in going, I want an extra star because I know it's going to be more energy efficient. Like that regulation and the tools that the governments have created they're not B2C. you know, they basically come down as kind of, this is what we expect developers or builders to build. How you want to tell that story is on you, as you know, as a developer. So, you know, for me, when I bought my house, like I had to go digging to find what the certificate was, and that's only a design certificate as well. So there's no as-built verification with it. So it's complete chalk and cheese when you start looking at, let's say, Australian regulatory requirements, and you know what's first of all in the market, and then secondly what Passive House is looking to achieve. Now, different jurisdictions are looking at upping the ante. We've got a code review coming in next year, so there's loads of speculation about, you know, how this might change. There's always conversations about, you know, can Passive House be recognized within the residential construction code? But there's so many ifs and buts. But at the moment, it's just chalk and cheese between how regulation is set up, how customers interface with the buying process, and then what Passive House is looking to achieve and support customers in it. So that's kind of why, I guess, you know, John, to close that out, that's kind of why, in a way, we've taken a bit of a lead on this, is that we know we can build better, we can build higher quality. We know that there is a percentage of the market that are willing to pay for it. And certainly preferred over competitive products. So we've kind of, the way we kind of look at it, we're trying to future-proof the business in a way by staying ahead of the curve. And what's good is the signals that do start to come from government, we can turn around to our development team and say, look, we're right in line with where this is going. We're just at the pointy end. But because we've been doing these pilots, because we've been scaling up, we've actually got the capacity in-house to be more, I guess, again, ahead of the curve with this, because not only do we have the designer, the tech smarts, and in a lot of cases, it's actually the consultant teams we work with, but also we've been on this journey with our sales and marketing team about how they can talk about zero carbon or zero energy or renewable energy or whatever the case may be. And where we've been most successful is when we've empowered our sales and marketing team. So it's the people that are literally on the sales floor, are at that coal face with customers. And you know, if you play in the volume space at all, you know, they're the people, they're actually the ones that are critical, because, you know, time and time again, and I'm not sure what other people's experiences are, but I guess the old kind of default position was people don't care. They don't care about energy, don't care about sustainability. And we've run so many different things now where it is, people do care. Yeah, of course, it's not 100%, but we have people, you know, putting their hands in their pocket and paying additional cash for something that they want because they believe in it. And when we've interrogated them, why did you want a carbon neutral home? Someone say, well, I'm not a greenie, but I've got a daughter and I'm trying to teach her about what's going on in the world. And this is an opportunity for me to teach her through buying a home. So that starts to talk about legacy. Another example is, when we asked the customer again, why did you buy one of our carbon neutral homes? Said, look, I just like it. I like what you guys are doing. It's different. And to be honest with you, this scheme is the difference between me buying your home over another home. So when you get all those little data points, and some of it is quite qualitative, it's very hard to quantify the value of someone making a decision based around that, but it's incredibly important. And those qualitative touch points are almost, if not more important than the quantitative touch points when you're trying to, take a sales or marketing team through why Passive House is different or why a zero energy home is different. So I think, that's maybe something that, we sometimes miss, is that, we get all the smarts and we design it and we build it and we go great. And well, it's just an amazing house. Of course, people are going to get it straight away. But if you don't take the time to actually sit down and work out that messaging, then, you'll sell them, but you won't have the impact, I think, that we're all looking to achieve.
Amy, I have the feeling you wanted to say something, at least you.
Oh, yes. I was just going to pick up on John's point, which was really good. And I think as Finns and the Passive House community, we do recognise that we have a real role to play in influencing policy. And we've seen examples from overseas where, like the example that you've given, John, changes in policy can have that real impact and can be that tipping point. So for example, responding to the MB consultation and making Ministry for Business, Environment, Innovation and Employment in New Zealand, and making the point that Passive House already will reach the goals that they have proposed, and so basically influencing government is part of, as Passive House Institute New Zealand, advocating for Passive House, our role, and also all of the members of the Passive House community.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a question based on kind of what Rory was talking about. How have you all seen word of mouth affect things, or just people experiencing a passive house? That's been a big thing that we have taken away from different examples of just getting people into a passive house, of people experiencing like the lack of drafts and constant temperatures and the sound insulation, and New York City being as loud as it is, of having a space that is very quiet and isolating you from your neighbors, and the street noise and the jackhammers and the honking and all of that can be very attractive. But I think often what it has taken is having people experience it, which is great on the one hand because it's very powerful and it really affects people's perceptions of what you're offering to them. On the other hand, it's a little bit daunting or discouraging because it's hard to do that at scale. It's hard to really communicate to a mass audience like, oh, here's the experience of being in a passive house or living in a passive house or spending some time in a passive house. So that's challenging to do with large numbers of people. But how have you felt that has it influenced your marketing, just like getting people to experience it, and connected to that, then them sharing that, like word of mouth? Do you feel like there's sort of this trend of people coming to you because they've spoken to someone who became, a passive house enthusiast, or at least became interested in it?
We definitely have, John. We were part of the Passive House Open Days this weekend and had 70 odd people coming up, and people posting on Instagram and social media and all sorts of bits and pieces have been fantastic. And we've already had other people getting in touch saying, oh, my friend went to visit and said it, etc., etc. But it's not just kind of the general public. It's also been other tradespeople, other designers, others in the industry, getting the builders on site. The builder on our projects, every single time a tradie came up or a supplier came up to drop something off, they'd ask them to come in and show them the windows and show them the ventilation system. And kind of, they were so excited about what they were doing. Kind of sharing that knowledge has been so fantastic. So I think if you've got the resource, just try and use it as much as possible. So yeah, I completely agree. Seeing and touching and feeling is so much better than seeing someone on a piece of paper. But as you say, it's quite difficult to get that to a larger market unless you're kind of getting word of mouth going and getting videos out there and photographs and non-stop talking about it like I do.
We have had great success. We've had 3 show homes. So we had one in Wellington, one in Waikato, and we have one in the Hawke's Bay. The power of the show homes is just for that exact reason you were saying, John. People walk in, you actually experience the passive house. And for those on this call, we know what that means, the silence, there's just something very serene about being inside a passive house. I'm not overstating it. And when they experience that, that is very powerful. So holding events at those homes, having them open and available, those particular regions that had show homes have done very, very well.
Great. Hey, I think Vicky has something to share about her quite unique approach of trying to entice people to build passive houses.
Yes, so I'm actually a property developer down in Wanaka, and I incentivize people to build energy efficient homes. So I have a covenant that before they submit their plans to council, they must model their plans with a PHPP modeler or something equivalent. I actually pay for the first $3,000 worth of modeling, but the idea is just to, well, obviously I'm trying to get everyone in my subdivision to build an energy efficient house. But beyond that, I'm really trying to drive the conversation away from how much per square meter does it cost to how houses perform. Once they've modeled their house, if they build to a low energy build standard, so the 30 kilowatts of energy used per meter square per annum, plus the 1 air exchange in the blower door test, then I give them 20 grand cash back. And if they get to 75 kilowatts of energy used plus a blower door test of 3 air exchanges, I give them 10 grand in cash back. So there's a strong incentive that will sort of hopefully get them talking about the cost benefit of if I added a bit of extra insulation into my slab and some better performing windows, maybe I'll get this this money to cover those costs, as well as live in a much healthier home. In addition, if they want to certify, then I do pay $2,000 towards their certification process. But the real thing I'm noticing is, like, I've got a lady in my subdivision, for instance, who bought, I didn't sell my houses or market them as affordable sections, or I wasn't looking for first-time buyers. I specifically looked for second-time buyers who had been in a house that was cold. And we have, you know, an extreme temperature down here in Wanaka. So this lady, she was living in her own home. They'd put in a new fireplace. They reinsulated their roof, and they also added a heat pump, which was the best heat pump she could get, because she wanted to turn it on just after lunch so that it would be warm when the family came home from school. So that's exactly the sort of person that I'm trying to target, someone who's experienced not enjoying their house no matter how hard they try. And she had never heard of anything to do with passive. She didn't know what I was talking about with thermal modelling or mechanical ventilation. Her husband's actually a roofer, and he didn't know anything about it. But they have told so many people, they have shared so much information from the Passive House Institute, from Jonathan Holmes, from all sorts of people. They are on the journey now. And my next step is actually, I think I'm going to maybe interview my residents and video them along their journey, and maybe make some kind of documentary or some kind of thing to sort of get this message out further. Yeah, it's really generating a lot of conversation, and we're in an area where there's quite a lot of awareness about Passive House, because we have some really well you know, some what are they called, pioneers in the area, like Jessica Ayers, and people, you know, who are doing great things. Jonathan's got the first premium passive house. So we've got great leaders, but we've also got the community is very community oriented and very green. And coming at it from a green perspective, that's a really big driver for people, the climate impacts. And when people realize that they are locking in their emissions in these standard home builds, and we're in a building boom here too, they really do feel like, God, I don't want to be that contributor building, you know, emitting 5 to 7 times what we need to meet the Paris Agreement, that sort of thing. That people are just going, oh gosh, from that climate perspective. But also, and not, this doesn't really apply so much to my subdivision, but to a lot of people in town here have unlimited budgets. Like, we've got expats and people cashing up vast sums in Auckland and coming down and building. So we're in an area that can really, people can choose whatever money can buy, they will spend to have the most luxurious and best performing products, but they don't know that they're not buying that until they start the conversation. So my little subdivision, that's what we're trying to do, is just put these incentives out there that get people talking. Well, what is modelling? Why would you model before you send your plans for consent? And just getting people to talk about it. So yeah, that's what I'm doing here in Wanaka.
Great, awesome. Thanks so much for sharing this, Vicky.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Well, I'm actually curious, like, once you introduce that conversation with these various mechanisms that you've put in place, what does that conversation look like? What's the like initial reaction? Like, what are people asking you? Like, oh, what is this thing? Like, why are you trying to get me to do it? What are people asking about first? Because you've obviously provided them with some hefty incentives to do it. And are they sort of curious then? Or are they just sort of like, yeah, I'll take you up on whatever you're offering? But like, what are the first questions like?
The first question is really bewilderment. Like they really get that it's cold in their house, or that we need to change. So they get that. They're like, oh my gosh, really? Like I say, it's not normal overseas to get condensation on your windows. And we talk about, we just talk about living in the house, and they're like, yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. And I'm like, well, there's no point insulating if you don't do the whole package. So we just have I try not to get into any technical conversations. I just refer them to someone like Arthur Lee, or someone that's better, has the knowledge. And so the questions that come up are, but won't it cost more? And then we have that conversation around, well, yes, it could cost you more for your windows, but it's not just the long-term savings. We talk about living with maybe a slightly smaller footprint, or just, you know, it's not just about running costs. It's about maybe you save on your underfloor heating because you won't need that, other sorts of things. So we just have a conversation. I just put it out there and leave it. I don't try and sell them anything. I just say, look, this is your choice, but you need to know about it. Change is going to happen. We need to do it for our environment. it's much better for you as a family. But and once they have that conversation, I really am not pushing it. I just say, I'm just trying to increase awareness, and it's rippling out, definitely. People are definitely having conversations, and their friends are getting involved, and it's, you know, it's, yeah, everybody sort of wants to know more.
Great. Hey, I would like to, I wonder, Andy, would you like to contribute something to explaining Passive House? Because Andy Marlowe won the International Explain a Passive House competition, and came up with a fairly easy and good way of doing this. Andy, are you happy? Are you happy to share some thoughts?
Sure. I've forgotten about that. Thanks, Cara. For anyone who didn't see it, it was me pouring water into a sieve at the same time that I poured it into a stainless steel bowl. It obviously got a message across. There was no exact correlation between the holes in the sieve. It was just whatever the sieve was. I contemplated putting a hole in the bowl to represent 0.6 air changes per hour, but I didn't want to sacrifice the bowl. Look, our firm's in a fairly unique and awesome position because most of the people who come to us are coming to us because of what we do. And therefore, I'm massively intrigued by these conversations because a lot that you're discussing, because a lot of them we don't have to have. We get a bunch of people who walk through a door and just go, I want a passive house. Or they use other words to describe it, but they're asking for the same thing. So in that sense, from the people who walk through our door, we have it kind of easy. I'm most interested by how everyone else is dealing with, and in particular, not just Rory, but people in Rory's position about the mass market and how that's going to shift, because that's ultimately what has to happen. So I'm intrigued by how we're going to transition. And I think it's an interesting point, and as an architect, it's problematic. A lot of it isn't, most of it isn't a design problem. Most of it's a construction problem. And obviously some of it's a sales problem at the beginning. So yeah, I'm not sure what else to really add, but I've enjoyed the conversations today. John, I thought the presentation was fantastic. And I like the comparisons with other industries. I think it resonates really well. I think that sings pretty good for most people. We've definitely found that talking to what resonates with each person is the way to go. We've ended up in the last couple of years with a much more diverse client base because of Passive House. So we used to attract basically deep green hippies, and now we also get, we still get them, but we also get a lot of people who are, to be blunt, a lot richer, who just want the more luxury side of things. And again, on a personal level, I find that harder to resolve because I have less in common. But it's also been interesting to see that sort of diversity come through. And I guess the final thing, John, you asked specifically about what had resonated with people. You're interested in sort of what angles had worked. I've got 2 clients at the moment whose primary motivation for a passive house is they don't like cockroaches. And in Sydney, cockroaches are a fairly common occurrence. And that's their, I wouldn't say it's their main driver, but that's the bit that got them. So there's no accounting for different people's desires and motivations.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing, Andy.
That's okay, no worries.
Hey, I think we're coming towards the end of this seminar, but I would like to ask our presenters, I would like to ask Shelley, Rory, and John to give us a bit of a closing here. So having listened to everyone, having the experience that you have, could you perhaps just briefly summarize what do you think, what's the most important thing for people to keep in mind who want to sell passive houses? Shelley, would you like to start us off?
Sure, thanks, Cara. I think the biggest thing is to be able to keep it simple so that people can understand about that. But I think we kind of, we're at a turning point now where we actually need to have our eyes further down the journey. And like what I mean by that is I think the biggest story to wrap around the passive house thing is the sustainability part, which we haven't really hung our hat, we haven't hung a hook off passive house with the sustainability space. So it's something that we're really passionate about, and the fact that we have a new generation of client coming through and they want it all. They want a high performing home, a passive house if they can have it. They don't want it to look ugly, and they don't want to pay a lot for it. And they want sustainable products. They want to know all of that. So, hey, let's work hard to make that happen. And we like to think at eHouse, we are thinking that far ahead. So thinking about beyond the passive house and leaning into that whole heart thing as well around, we're partnering with the likes of Bremworth. You know, they've gone out, they're a New Zealand-based company. They're only now producing wool carpets. We love that. Working with resines, low-volt paint, working with Neocrete and a 30% reduction in cement and the low carbon stuff, filtering, you know, tap wear and water volume, filtering all of that stuff into your passive house story makes it so compelling for people when they think, oh my goodness, I get this and I get this, this is just like beyond my wildest dreams. That, and the fact that we've gone ahead and done that legwork for them, we've partnered with those right people, we're able to have done all that thinking, makes the story even better. So that would be my in closing.
Kia ora, Shelley. Rory, anything that's on your mind in this regard?
Thanks, Cara. I think my 2 cents would be that there's no silver bullet when it comes to messaging these kind of initiatives. There's no unicorn, message that's just going to land and always work. What you can, and the other thing too, is that the story is always going to evolve. How we build these, how we design these, how we live in homes is always going to evolve. Look at, we all need a home office now at this stage, or we all need a space where we can go and take a call. So what I would say that while this messaging will always change, the one thing that will stay true is just spending your time with your customers, understanding what their values are, and then aligning your messaging or what you're trying to deliver with those values. And once you've got that hook, then you'll be able to open the door. And if it has to be cockroaches, then it's cockroaches.
Thank you, Rory. John, any closing words from you?
Yeah, I think the rule of thumb that we try to stick to the most is just make it personal, because no matter what industry we have been looking at, whether it's like sustainable food, sustainable fashion, or just communications around climate in general, is trying to do like broad concepts. It's really difficult to get stuff to resonate with people. But if you do make it personal, so as many of you have mentioned, cockroaches or drafts or just general comfort. Like everyone has the experience their entire life of being in their home, and there are certain things that are great about that, and there are certain things that you wish were better. And one of the things would be drafts or sound or cockroaches or whatever it might be. Just make it personal, I think, is the big thing. And also there's been some of the discussion around what do you call a non-passive house, so like a traditional home, that's going on in the chat. And one of the things that I have found resonates with people is kind of almost the same language that we use around sustainable food systems versus industrial food systems. And it does seem to tap into people's understanding that a lot of people have heard that sort of comparison where we have really industrialized our food system. And it's similar with the home, where it's like we took this industrial brute force approach of just pump in energy to heat or cool, and it all leaks out, but just add more energy. And it's really just add more rather than designing a holistic system that all just works together and it's circular and it doesn't just require this external brute force industrial. That I would almost propose industrial home is the thing that we should be moving away from, and we should be moving more toward a holistic home. I also wanted to give a little shout out to Vicky. I realized I actually stayed in Wanaka 2 years ago for one night when I was driving around New Zealand, and I knew that it rang a bell, and I just Googled it, and it was very beautiful. So we'd love to check out your passive houses there. But thank you, everyone. This was super interesting, and I was able to learn a lot just based on the different comparisons that we were able to make here. And thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Shelley and Rory. I learned a lot from you and Cara for organizing.
Thanks, John. Thank you so much, John, Rory, and Shelley, for being available for this seminar, and everyone else who contributed. Kia ora, thank you so much. Those of you who've registered for this course, you will be able to find the recording on the online learning platform. There's also a bit of additional material there, so please do head to the online learning platform if you haven't been there before. Recording will take a few hours to render and being uploaded there, but then for the next 2 weeks, you'll be able to recap things that we've talked about in your own time. And if you want to go back to over John's slides, you will see the recording of the slides with his commentary. Hey, thank you so much for being here today. Thanks for joining with this talk. Oh, if you're a certified Passivhaus professional, there are CPD points from Passivhaus Institute to be had for this talk. You'll also find the code there on the online learning platform, so please head there if you haven't been there already. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great night, John in New York, and everyone else. Have a great rest of your day. Ka kite anō.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.